Hey guys, welcome back to Tower of God, a new world. Now, in today's video, we're going to be looking at an end game tier list. Don't jump to the back and look at it. I got a big disclaimer that I want to put here. So, Monkey is the guy who's completed all of the trial mode, chapter 26 of campaign, who I spoke to about some of those end game units that he was looking at for DPS. He threw together his impression of a tier list at the end game with where he is, based on every unit being pretty much maxed. So, I wanted to go through this, but I also, before I put it on the screen and people start raging, I just want to give the massive disclaimer that this is from one person's opinion. So obviously this could change. These are very subjective. It's not 100% right. Also, keeping in mind, when you're looking at people who are testing with every unit maxed, units like Hats, your hyper carry, becomes less valuable because you've got tanks built and you need a DPS that's going to deal the most DPS, whereas units like Hats don't do that. They're just good because they can both pseudo tank at hyper carry and also DPS. So that's what I wanted to put out. So just don't rage it when you see it. This is just one person's opinion, and I thought it's an interesting perspective to look at the end game, what people are feeling about it, because I myself am not there, so I can't speak to it. So let's jump into it. Once again, take it with a grain of salt. This is just looking at someone else's perspective. So let's get into it. If I can find which one it was, there it is. Okay, so I'm gonna go through it. Basically, when we look at the S tier, all the SSR pluses fall in there except for Karaka. Now, Karaka is one I definitely want to test duped out to see how he does function. But it seems like for him, on his opinion, Karaka is sort of that in-between where he doesn't do enough carry damage, but he also doesn't tank as well as the Zahards and Mashni, especially Zahard when you get all the dodge value into him, and he's got his extra evasion and stuff like that. And he doesn't carry as well as the DPS units there, and obviously Evans on his own as a support. So that's what we're looking at for the SSR pluses. Now, this is pretty universal across the board for me. These three supports being absolutely cracked. I don't see anything wrong with that. I see Bomb as like my favorite support in the game. Just that instant buff. He can just him plus a hyper carry unit and you're set. Like, you just get a good carry and Bomb just goes, okay, we win. Not always, obviously, deficit's a thing, but you get the gist. Him at maxed with the extra energy is nuts. Kun with energy is nuts because he ults faster and he puts the dome out and just stuns everyone sooner. It's wicked. I absolutely love it. Then we've got Naray, just great energy, battery, defense breaks, everything. Just an all-round amazing support to help your main carry. Now, we touched on Karaka. We've then got, obviously, Endorsi. Endorsi just being all-round solid, maxed out. Obviously, she's going to have more capacity to stall. She can still group enemies, all that sort of stuff. Next out, we have Zhao, however you say her name. And she's going into the A tier. Now, this is an early estimation of her, so take this one with a grain of salt as well. But in general, solid healing, solid support. You know, not a bad unit at all, but like not cracked support like these ones that like completely enable things to happen. So that's why she's there. Arc Raptor, we spoke about him in the previous video as a DPS unit. Obviously not coming up to par with the DPS SSR pluses at maxed, but as an SSR option, he's finding them quite useful. Same with Rachel. We covered both of them in the video previously. And then we've got Hua. Hua can deal decent damage and also great support, but the squishiness is the issue that drags her down a bit. What he found, she stands back, yes, and then it's just she's a struggle to stay alive, but also on a lot of the replays I see him using as well, he is still using that Hua to get the value out of it. Moving on from that, we got green element buff, we've got yellow element buff, and we've got blue element buff. The green one works well if you're using it as a hard or something like that, but in general, those are your elemental buffers at the start of battle, and that's why they're in there. Then we move into this range. Now, when we look at damage units, just keep in mind, it's really hard for anyone to place all damage units on a list. Even if you've tested them all, you kind of find the ones you like, especially when you're in this phase of using, like, you've pushed your account to the point by using SSR pluses that have dupes, and then you try testing these guys. and they just don't work at that same deficit, if that makes sense. So, like, you know, take it with a grain of salt on these damage dealing units. But in general, I feel like this is a pretty good assumption from what I've gathered from the characters myself. His multipliers look good. His control looks good. Once again, I just want to test him. I've seen great things from him. I've seen great things from him. Honestly, I've heard nothing about him. He is just a dodge unit, so I feel like he's going to have value if he dodges enough. Chicken, I've seen great results from. This dude's fantastic for his grappling hook. That's amazing. And this guy's just a beast with his shields. And I have seen Monkey using this guy a bit as well. Moving on from that, we're going to jump down into this C tier. Now, we get into like the fringe units. Now, the big one here is going to be Hatsy Boy. Now, Hat's down here. Now, I don't know if this was a bit more of a bold statement, but the thing with Hats is that he doesn't have the highest damage output. In the mid game, I still put him as the best SSR. Like, for a new player, I still think he's the best SSR unit to put on your primary wishlist spot and build as your first carry, because he can carry when the rest of your units are low, because he can also dodge tank. I think he's absolutely fantastic for it. I will never change my mind on that. But even when I was building Hats, because you can see the damage multipliers of other units, the main one I was looking at was Wang, but obviously we have Arc Raptor, who's a savage. We've got Rachel as well, but his damage isn't quite as high, and he doesn't get like the guaranteed crits. So eventually when it becomes purely about the DPS, once you have tanks built and stuff, Hats was always going to fall off. But I think for a lot of free-to-play players, once you reach chapter 26, I still think your roster will be at a point that Hats will still be more valuable. So just because you won't have every character max. So when you look at, you know, players in chapter 26 right now versus players in chapter 26 2 months from now, it's going to be a different type of roster that players have and a different level range. So I still think Hats will be right up there. But once again, we're looking at one person's perspective with every character maxed. With her, he said she's basically, he said that instead of dashing the enemy opposite, I guess it's kind of a situation like this, but you don't have the extra life. But he finds that she just dashes and dies, essentially. And I think that's the same thing with this guy. However, you can disrupt enemy formations with these two, so still not the end of the world. Lack of survival over here, and just not the biggest damage. Yes, a bit of control, but just struggling out there. Tanking, honestly, I didn't ask him too much about these two. Just tanks that aren't really performing as well. If we look into the tank range, we've got Rock, or Gator, I like to call him, who's more of a... he's a supportive tank, and you know he has extra value outside of tanking. And then we've got him, who's just like the shield. Like, he's got a big shield on ult, but he just gets spams these shields with his basic attacks, which is huge. So that's what they are. And then we drop down into the D tier. The Assassin, don't get me wrong, the Assassin's still an absolute monster for boss fights. This is looking at campaign. Monster for boss fights with that defense shred on his ultimate. It's huge, but you know, in campaign, really struggles to use. He said from his testing with this dude, now I think this guy could be good, and I'm still keen to try this guy myself. But he said basically he dashes and dies is the basic issue with him, because he doesn't have the survival, but he just dashes to the enemy's back row and then dies. Honestly, I have no idea about this character. No idea about this character. I know this guy like counterattacks the first enemy that attacks him, kind of like Gray, but no, I can't tech use him. It just doesn't work for me. So it's just a little flick, and it's not as long as CC. But yeah, these three, I've just never even bothered to venture into too much, so this could be a bad take. I don't know how much testing you did on them, but yeah, I don't really know too much about them at all. But that is pretty much it. In general, I think this is a pretty good list and pretty much reflects my thoughts on the mid game as well. Once again, the mid game if you had dupes into these guys. But the only one exception would be for me is Hats, where in the mid game, like my personal list, he would be up here. But obviously, if you've got every character maxed out and you don't have the same survival issues, because not every other character on your team is at like green star rating, and you've got this Rainbow Hats that's doing everything for you. Once you've got all those units built, his damage just isn't quite up to scratch with everything else. But I think that's pretty much it. I just wanted to give you guys that perspective. Once again, don't take this as the word. This is one person's perspective, but I also like looking at other people's perspective who are in a state of the game that 99% of us aren't. And I always find that valuable to look into the future. Just get an idea. Like I said, don't take it as the word, but just take some consideration into what you see, and that's the way I like to play it. But as always, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you have an awesome day, and I look forward to seeing the next one. Cheers.